Hey, what's up? It's Pat again from Smart Passive Income, and welcome to video 5 of this podcasting tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about feeds. No, not that type of feed. We're going to be talking about your podcast's feed. And again, we're going to get a little technical here today, but I'm going to try to help you out. So let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so going back to the whiteboard here, you may recognize this diagram from the last video where we talked about why we need to host our media files on a host separate from our web host. You know, our web host serves our website. Our media host is where we drop our MP3 file, and whenever someone plays that MP3 file, it's going to play off of the media host and not on our web host. It's very important to do that. And in that last video, I talked about how our website generates what's called a feed, and it's that feed that we actually give to places like iTunes, Stitcher, and BlackBerry, and Zune, and all those other places. So let me put directories for now. The thing is, if you give the podcast directories the feed as it is now from your site without doing anything additional to it, they're not going to see the MP3 file in your feed. You know, it's not properly enclosed is what they call it. They're not going to see the MP3 file, and they're not going to know it's a podcast that you're publishing. So it's not even going to read as a podcast. And yes, we've already tagged the MP3 file with your episode and your show information, but without adding some additional information to this specific feed, the directories aren't going to read it as a podcast. They need some sort of signal, some additional code within the feed that lets them know that a podcast episode has just been published. And this code is going to include things like the title of the show, description, author, host, summary, name, email, category, copyright, and all those sorts of things. Now, if you're crazy, you can create this file yourself so your RSS feed does include this information, which I know some people have done in the past because they want 100% complete control, and they're coders and they understand that stuff. I'm not a coder. I don't understand that stuff. And really the easiest and one of the most popular ways to do this, to add that information in that feed, which you need to add in order to have the directories read it as a podcast, is to use a WordPress plugin. A podcasting plugin you can install on your site that allow you to enter all the information you need to enter for your show just one time in the beginning, so that automatically, every time you publish a new podcast episode on your site, it knows to include all that information about your podcast in the feed so that the directories can read it correctly. Now, there's a lot of different podcasting plugins out there. I'm going to list a bunch of them right now and then share with you the one that I recommend. There's a lot of popular ones out there, like PowerPress is a popular one. There's another one called Podcasting Plugin by TSG, I believe it is. And then there's one called PowerPress. That's the one that you want to go with. It's the most robust, most powerful, and it has a lot of support, consistent support, which is great, which is why I actually don't recommend using FeedBurner. And another thing with FeedBurner, you know, the way it works is your feed from your site goes to FeedBurner, and then your FeedBurner account gives you a separate feed that you can then upload to the directories. And what's nice about that is FeedBurner gets to keep track of stats and things like that, but PowerPress will do that for you anyways. But the bad thing is, what if FeedBurner dies? And the thing is, there's a lot of rumors that it's going to do that. Is it going to? I don't know. But if FeedBurner dies, then there's no connection between your site and the directories anymore. It's just gone. What's nice about PowerPress is that's run off your own site, and the feed that you get from PowerPress, it's always connected to your site, so you don't have to worry about that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to an example website, install PowerPress from scratch, go through the settings with you, set it up correctly, get your feed, this feed here, and then we're going to publish our first episode. It's going to be a fake episode using a file that I already have, but you know, I just want to walk through the process with you as if you were doing this for the first time. And then in the next video, we still haven't even submitted to the directories yet. You still want to publish your podcast episodes first before you do that, and I'll tell you how many to do before you submit to places like iTunes and Stitcher and Zune and BlackBerry. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video, where and how to submit to those directories. And that'll be it. Then you're done. So this is probably the most important section here, because you want to get your feeds correctly, because again, these directories read your feed. In order for that feed to be structured properly, you're going to use PowerPress. So let's go ahead and do it. Let's go to the example site. All right, so you're actually looking at the homepage of one of my niche sites in the security guard training industry, actually. So what I'm going to do is pretend like I'm going to set up a totally new podcast for this site. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my dashboard, and I'm going to install a plugin like I would install any other plugin. I would go to the plugin section here on the left-hand side and click on Add New, and then I'm going to search for PowerPress. In here, you'll see right at the top the blueberry PowerPress podcasting plugin. That's the one you want to install. Am I sure I want to install that? Yes. Then you want to go ahead and activate it. And to get to the settings, you'll scroll down here on the left-hand side and see a new menu setting for PowerPress. So go ahead and just click on that. Okay, so this is your basic welcome page with news and highlights and things like that. We don't need to worry about that. We're going to go ahead and go to basic settings now, and this is for the podcast entry box, and I'll show you what that is in a second. The first thing we want to do is make sure that these top two boxes are checked, media URL and media file size and duration. And what this is actually if I open a new post and I scroll beneath the edit post area down here, you'll see podcast episode, media URL, file size, and duration. Those are the settings we checked. All of these other settings here are just optional. They're basically ways to override things that automatically happen, and you can look at those and play around with them if you want. But the most important thing is we want to have the ability to enter our URL from our media host. I use Libsyn again, and this will be the file and URL that ends in .mp3. And once you click verify, it actually determines the file size and also the duration, which is important. That's what you need. That's it. Down here, you'll see actually default media URL. You can delete that. That's if you had a specific folder and wanted to make it easy and just give the episode name instead of the full URL. But since we're going to copy the full URL where our media is hosted, we don't have to worry about that. So just leave default media URL blank, and everything else is ready to go. Click on Save Changes. Great. Now, services and stats, we don't need to worry about that now. You can come and check that later once you start to get your podcasts going. Now, let's go to media appearance. This is where you determine what happens on your site to play your podcast if you wanted to. You can enable that. The media player, you could disable it. Under here, you can have it show below the page content, above the page content. You don't even have to change anything there. And of course, you can always come back and change this, and it's not going to hurt anything. You can mess around and see what works for you. Now, I do want to explain under media links really quick some of these cool features. Display player in new window link, that's important because when people play it, it plays in a new window, which is good because then people can close the original window and still surf the web and still be listening to your show. They're not going to accidentally close the window and then accidentally stop listening to you. Display download link, that gives people the option to download your file to their computer if you want. And then display player embed link, that's cool because people can actually copy a piece of code from the player, put it on their own site, and then have other people listen to your show from there, which is pretty cool. So I'm just going to save the changes really quick. Now, this is probably the most important tab here. It's the Feeds tab. The feed, remember, is what we submit to the directory. So this is really important that we get all this right. So I'm going to walk through all these options one by one. It's going to take a little bit of time, but let's go ahead and get started. So underneath Enhance Feeds, just make sure Enhance All Feeds is clicked on. That's easy. Under Podcast Feeds, you'll see that there's a warning here. It says you must create at least one podcast episode for your podcast feed to be valid. Our podcast feed is this particular link right here, which is a special podcast only feed. And that feed shows only podcast episodes. And that's what we want to submit to the podcasting directories. Your website has its own feed with blog posts and podcast episodes and anything else, but that has a ton of information and it's a lot cleaner if you just submit a podcast only feed, this link here, to iTunes and all the other directories. It's much easier for them to read everything. The thing is, this feed isn't valid until we have our first episode, and I'll show you how to post an episode in just a second. So just keep in mind this URL. This URL is what's going to be submitted to all the directories, so we'll come back and validate this in a second. Okay, scrolling down, feed discovery, you don't need to worry about that too much. Under feed settings, show the most recent X number of episodes per feed. Now, a feed generally, especially in WordPress, it kind of defaults around 10. So if someone looks at your feed or a podcast or some sort of directory looks at your feed, it sees the latest 10 things, and that's it. For a podcast, you might want to think about bumping that up a bit because, for example, if you have 12 episodes out and you only show 10 in your feed, anything that reads the feed, like those directories, are only going to see the latest 10. They're not going to see episode 1 and 2. They're going to see 3 to 12. So you might want to bump this up to something like 50. That's okay. And again, when you get to 50 episodes, you're going to want to come back and change this to 100 or something. I have mine at 100. But, in the beginning, you could just keep it at 50 or something. Now, under here, it says Rss To Image. You want to image for your RSS feed. This is separate than the iTunes artwork, but it's still required, and it should be the same piece of artwork actually, and it should be about 300 by 300 pixels in size. And to upload a new image here, all you have to do is click on this button. Then you can click on Choose File. I'm just going to grab one that I just created for fun here for this particular example, and you should see it in a second. You can change the feed language if you wanted to. You can change the copyright. This symbol is the the C with a circle in it, so you can just keep that. That's the kind of code for it. Security guard training, your security guard training resource 2012, that's fine. Location, you can make that option. You can put that in there if you want. Episode frequently, you can do that if you want to. By weekly. Some directories will display this information. San Diego. It's up to you. And that's it for your feeds tab. So let's go ahead and click Save Changes. And if I scroll down, I can preview that image there. I'll click on Preview. See, there it is. SGTHQ Podcast. All right. I'm just going to close that. Now we're going to head over to the iTunes tab. This one's very important as well, because this is where we set our show information, all the stuff that's going to be found in iTunes. And remember, iTunes is a search engine. It's a huge search engine. We don't normally think of iTunes as a search engine. So all the stuff we put in here for the show title, your host name, the description, it's all really important. So we're going to go ahead and go through each of these one by one as well. So this first line here says iTunes subscription URL. This is actually the link to your show on iTunes. But of course, we don't have a show on iTunes yet, so you're just going to leave this blank. But just for future reference, once you get approved by iTunes after you submit your feed, you're going to get approved within 48 hours probably. You're going to go to your show on iTunes like this. You're going to right-click on your title, click Copy Link, and then paste that in here. That's the easy way to get the correct link here with your podcast name and ID number and stuff, as you can see there. That's not, this particular link isn't this particular podcast, so I'm going to delete that and leave it blank for now, which is what you should do at this point. Now down here, you're going to see a reiteration of the feed to submit to iTunes. Again, this is your podcast-only feed here. Now you're going to notice something interesting here. Under iTunes feed settings, you'll see the subtitle, your summary, which is the description, and all this stuff shows up in iTunes. But where's your podcast title? It's not here. It's actually, the title matches the title of your blog. So to set that, actually, you're going to actually go to Settings and General, and the title of your podcast is the site title here. So mine would be Security Guard Training, your Security Guard Training resource. That's what would be the podcast title. But going back to iTunes here, what if you want your podcast title to be different from your blog title, which is the case for many. It is for me in Smart Passive Income. I have the Smart Passive Income blog, and then I have the Smart Passive Income podcast. Those are two different titles. If you want two different titles, you're going to have to do an extra step. So follow me closely. It's pretty easy, actually. You go to your welcome page, and you see these advanced options down here. Click on Custom Podcast Channels, and click Save Changes. And what that does is it creates this little podcast channels link underneath PowerPress. Now, if you don't see that, sometimes it doesn't show up right away, you can always click on this Configure Podcast Channels link on the right-hand side of that advanced option you just clicked. So I'm going to click this right now and show you what's up. Here you can actually add new podcasting channels in addition to our default podcast channel here. You can see some of the example usages under here, but we're actually going to edit this podcast-only feed to change the title. So I'm going to click on Edit underneath Podcast. And as you can see here, it has a lot of the same settings as before. The feed settings with the image and things like that. It has iTunes settings and everything for this feed. This basically overrides anything. So anything we change here, it'll override the default settings we just set. So all we want to do really here, so we don't double our work, is just add the feed title. This is where we're going to override the feed title, which is normally the blog title. As you can see, if we leave it blank here, it's just going to be the blog title. But I'm going to add its own title. It's going to be the Ultimate Security Guard Training Podcast, and that's all I'm going to change here. And you can override other things if you want, but we're going to mess with these settings, or we have already messed with these settings anyways. So like most recent X episodes and things like that. So I'm just going to click on Save Changes. And that's it. Now our podcast feed has its own title separate from our blog post, our blog title. So I'm actually going to go back into Settings and go back into iTunes. And we're going to go over each of these, each of the rest of the stuff on the iTunes page, because again, this is what iTunes is going to read on our feed. So we talked about the iTunes subscription URL. You're going to get that after you submit your podcast feed to iTunes, which I'll show you in the next video. Under iTunes feed settings, the iTunes program subtitle is sort of a short description of what your podcast is about. And I honestly don't know where iTunes uses this sort of subtitle. I have yet to find out exactly, but it's still important just in case. So I'm just going to add a quick little description in there. It's maybe 200 characters long. Make sure to include a few keywords that relate to your particular industry. Try to think of keywords that people might type in to look for your show. That's really important. Now, for the iTunes program summary, if I go actually into iTunes, this is what the description is. So it's what's shown underneath your podcast title, and that's very important, especially when it comes to keywords. So I'm just going to paste a little something there. No HTML. You can have up to 4,000 characters. I think this description here is only about, a few hundred. So you have a lot of room to work with and a lot of space in there to include some keywords. Don't just keyword stuff and randomly add keywords, comma after comma after comma. But let it make sense. But be wise too. Like for example, here I have security guard training, of course, security guard industry, classes, information, education, protection services, career, unarmed guard, armed security guard. Those are all keywords that I know that are used in that industry that are highly searched for in Google. And so I'm going to include them in the iTunes program summary here as well. Now, don't click this optimize iTunes summary. What that does is it just changes a few things that you don't need right now. Or that aren't even enabled anymore. Go to iTunes program keywords. Just put in about 12 keywords separated by commas. Again, probably a lot of the same keywords that you would have mentioned in your summary and a few in your program subtitle as well. Your iTunes category, that's very important as well. That's the category that that your podcast is going to be shown up in. And there's a number to select from. If I go into iTunes right now, you see my category is business, and then marketing and management. This is the sub category within business. And if I go to podcast here, you'll see there's a whole number of different ones you could choose from education, games, kids, and so on and so forth. If you just click on here to scroll down, I'm just going to look at education, and then I'm going to select category 2, education training. Category number 3. And you can pick up the 3 categories. I'm just going to select, government and organizational. Or organizations. I don't know. I would probably spend a little bit more time thinking of what the categories are. I would actually look in iTunes, see what you're up against, see what shows may be the right for you or near to what your show is about, so that other listeners can listen to yours too. You can get what happens is people can find your show by listening to other shows that other people have listened to. For example, here underneath my show, you can see Tim Conley's, you can see Sterling and Jay's here, Chris Ducker, copy blogger, Dan Andrews, underneath mine. And that's how a lot of people find other people's podcasts, is through what other people listen to. So what I would do is actually, for example, if you're in the business section, I would go through each of these and try to look for ones that are similar to yours. If sometimes it's obvious, like if you have an investing podcast, well, you want to be in the investing section. So just use your common sense and choose 3 categories. Make sure to use 3 to get the most bang for your buck. iTunes explicit, that means if you have any like swear words or you talk about things that kids probably shouldn't listen to, you want to put yes, explicit content. You want to be really upfront with that. You can get your podcast kicked off of iTunes if you are not transparent with that. Again, we're going to add our iTunes image here. This is a 1400 by 1400 pixel image. This is going to be the same image that you have in your default feed setting, but it's going to be much larger. Again, this is because of the new devices that are coming out, which are, that have Retina display and all that stuff. So what I'm going to do is actually click on Upload New Image, choose File, and this one you'll see here. I wonder if I can preview it from here. No, not yet. I'll have to save first. But I'll show you that in a second. iTunes talent name. This is you. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to put Patrick Flynn, which is me. But I'm going to show you a little bit of a small secret here. You'll see If I go back to my podcast here on iTunes, you'll see that the talent name or the host name is Pat Flynn, but I also add a colon and a few keywords to help me be found in iTunes a little bit more, because again, iTunes is a search engine. So if for instance, if I type in online entrepreneur, you'll see that my podcast should come up number 1. There you go. That's because, it's in the name there, and I also mention it in the description as well. Now, again, don't go crazy. This looks somewhat natural, Pat Flynn, online entrepreneur, business strategist, and blogger. That makes sense. But if you put like 100 keywords in there, there's potential that you won't be submitted into iTunes when you submit your podcast. So just use common sense here, but be smart and use a few keywords that describe who you are. So I'm going to put, for example, again, I'm not going to actually submit this podcast, but I'll show you how to do it. Patrick Flynn, security guard, training expert. I can even do unarmed and armed security guard training expert. That's just for example. Now my email, Pat Flynn at securityguardtraininghq.com. And then this iTunes new feed URL, you would use that if you are changing your feed URL from something else to this one that you have now. Since this is the first time you're setting up, you don't need to do anything. And after that, you can just click on Save Changes. And boom, you're all set and ready to go. At this point, you can post your first podcast episode on your blog. And I'm going to walk you through how to do that right now. So I'm going to set up my first podcast episode here on this site. So to do that, it's just like you're writing a new blog post. Go to Posts and click on Add New. And then now we have to name our show. Now there's some tips for naming your show. You might want to include the show number so people know which particular episode that is. I like to go, for instance, Security Guard Training HQ 001. I like to add multiple zeros in case I get into the triple digits. It'll still be in order. And then colon or a dash or whatever, and then the name of the show. So welcome. Oops, that's totally wrong. Welcome to the Security Guard Training Podcast. So this will be episode 1. Of course, I haven't recorded this actual episode yet. I'm going to use a sample file here. But as far as what goes in the actual blog post, you might want to include things like a quick summary of what that post is about. Also some links that you mentioned on the show. One tip that I like to do is if I forget to keep track of the links that I mentioned during the show, or sometimes you don't know what links are going to come up, especially if you have a guest, I like to listen to the show again afterwards at sometimes double or quadruple the speed, just so I can make sure I get all the resources in. I do that using a tool called VLC Player. It just allows me to quickly listen to things much faster, so I can get all that information, write it down as I go along, pause it if I need to create time just to write things down as it goes along. So I can come back here, get all the links and things that like that. I also like to include items mentioned in this podcast. I also like to do things like, in this particular episode, you will learn, and then I create like a bullet list of things that are interesting that will make people want to listen. Item 1, item 2, etc., and things like that. So eventually you want to include some subscription links, but since we haven't submitted to iTunes yet, there are no subscription links to use for iTunes. But that's it. So now the question is, well, how do you get the MP3 file in here so that when I push publish, the feed knows it's a podcast and I can submit it to iTunes and stuff? So actually, the first thing you want to do is actually add it to a podcasting category. And the main reason why you want to do that is just to neatly organize all your podcasts. People can come to your blog, click on or find the category podcast category, and see a list of all your podcasts if you wanted to do that. So I'd make sure to do that. But then really the trick is down here when you scroll down under where it says podcast episode default, you want to include the media URL, which is the link for that episode that is stored on a media host somewhere. So for me, it's on Libsyn. So I'm actually going to go to Libsyn right now, libsyn.com. It might be on Amazon S3 for you. We talked about that in one of the previous videos. So if you don't have that link handy for this particular episode, this is how you go get it, at least from Libsyn. You can go to this link here, which is view the show's previous posts. And this will include the files that you've uploaded, even as standalone files. And go to the episode that you want to go to, click on links, and then get the direct download URL, which is that link there. You want to copy the whole thing, go back and just include that file here, just paste it there and click on verify. Now it's going to auto-detect the size and auto-detect the length, which is exactly what we want. And now you can publish this episode after you have all the information you want in it. Again, make sure the permalink is what you want it to be. Sometimes I change it to be more SEO friendly, depending on what the topic is. So I'm just going to hit publish. And now I'm going to view this post. I'm going to delete this after this tutorial because this file is actually for my Smart Passive Income podcast. It's not quite time to publish it on my site yet, which is why I'm using it here for example. But as you can see, here's this post. The name of the post here, summary, links, items mentioned in this podcast, item 1, item 2, so on and so forth. And then here's the player, and I'll play it for you really quick. This is the Smart Passive Income podcast with Pat Flynn, session number 49. And so that's that. I can play it in a new window. There's the download link. There's an embed link for you there if people want to use that. And that's it. So this is our first episode. It's published on the site. Again, we haven't given our podcast only feed to any directories yet. That's what we're going to do in the next video. But I want to show you something really quick about this feed and sort of what's in it, and just to make sure, sort of test you can do to make sure that it's valid. So if you go back to WordPress in your backend and you click on PowerPress, and if you go to feeds, and then back down here where it says podcast feeds, the Ultimate Security Guard Training Podcast, and click on validate, again, that warning disappeared, so that's a good sign. I'm going to click on validate. It's going to open something called Feed Validator. That's feedvalidator.org, and it's going to put our feed automatically through this tool, which tests and sees if our feed is valid. And it says, well, congratulations, this feed is valid. Great. You might have an error or two of some things that, I don't really know what this means. I wouldn't worry about it. Down here, you'll see some of the stuff that we've added. Remember, we changed the title of the podcast from the name of the blog, which is Security Guard Training Headquarters, to this, which is the Ultimate Security Guard Training Podcast. Again, we did that using the podcast channel setting down in the back end of WordPress. Where did I go here? There's a lot of other things we changed or we updated. Again, you can see the iTunes summary here. You can see the iTunes author, which includes a couple of my security guard training keywords there. You could see the email and all the other things we added there here in this feed. So it's working correctly. Down here, you're going to see a link to that particular title in the episode, and everything's working correctly. You could see the actual enclosure for the MP3 file there, which was done again with that space underneath the episode, underneath the blog post that we set up, and yeah, it's all set up and ready to go. So yeah, that's it. So that's how you validate your feed and make sure it's good. Now remember, in the next video, we're taking this link here. This is our podcast only feed, and we're going to submit this exact URL to all the different directories we want to submit it to. So I'll see you in the next video. Congratulations for getting this far. You are almost done. Awesome job. Let's keep going. One more video.